was like, oh, I better actually look into this, and not let time or indecision make the decision for me.
A little over a decade ago now, a fertility preservation process called embryo freezing was being used to help those with cancer preserve their fertility prior to their treatment. Unfortunately, the methods used meant that you couldn't reliably freeze eggs in the same way. This meant that only cancer patients who were ready to create embryos with their partner or donor sperm could really take advantage of this technology. But then, the process to freeze embryos and eggs had been overhauled, and a new technique was being used, a technique called vitrification. Vitrification meant that egg freezing was something that could be done with significantly improved success compared to the previous method. That meant that egg freezing would be significantly improved for those with cancer, but it also meant that egg freezing was a viable option for those who needed to freeze their eggs for other reasons as well. So in today's episode, our guest is going to share her experiences, how she came to learn about fertility preservation, and why, for her, it's a real life-changing solution to a potentially significant problem. I'm Dan Bolger with Progyny, and this is Infertility.
My name is Shannon Fender. I'm 34 years old, and I work at VF Corporation. I'm the senior manager for state government affairs, which basically means I'm a lobbyist at the state and local level.
Yes, today's guest is Shannon Fender. We're going to learn a lot about Shannon today, but before we dive in, I just need to say the words that are written on the teleprompter. Here's a reminder to subscribe and like the content if you do in fact like it. And if you can leave a rating and review on a podcast app or hit the like button on YouTube, that would be extremely helpful as well. Of course, this show is powered by Progyny. And if you want to learn more about Progyny, you can visit progyny.com. And if you want help bringing the Progyny benefit to your employer, we have resources for you at progyny.com/talktohr. Okay, as I mentioned at the top, today's story is about fertility preservation, often called egg freezing. And as I alluded to, there are many reasons one might need to freeze their eggs. And that brings us to Shannon. Like many, Shannon found herself not interested in having children in her 20s.
Yeah, I swore up and down in my 20s that I didn't want kids, wasn't going to have them, and then kind of stereotypically reached my 30s and realized that might not be true for me. So here I am in my mid-30s and don't have a partner currently and not looking to start a family right away, but interested in preserving my fertility to a later date, and very much understanding that there is a biological clock associated with that.
Nothing too shocking there, right? People are choosing to have children later and later than ever before. And of course, there are even many people who are choosing to simply not have children at all. But for those who decide that they do want to pursue parenthood, but just not yet, not today, well, they face a few difficult realities. Women's fertility in particular is impacted by age. So there's always this pressure that can exist just under the surface. That's just human reproduction. And until relatively recently, there was really nothing that we could do about this. And then came vitrification, and fertility preservation of eggs for future use became a real option. And it started to be something that people were hearing about.
Yeah, I think I first heard about egg freezing during a Sex and the City episode. Miranda talked about, creating a fertility savings account. And so I was kind of familiar with that concept. And then, of course, had heard about IVF, over time. And I had several friends who, for different reasons, either had frozen their eggs or gone through IVF. And so I did know about it beforehand.
Yes, Sex and the City was one of the early pop culture references to egg freezing, and likely the way an entire generation discovered this option. And why I'd go short of calling it a fertility savings account. Success rates are really high, but nothing in reproductive health is really guaranteed the way a savings account would be. Egg freezing is still a wonderful way to protect yourself down the road for when you're ready to try to have a baby. Now, we've gotten way too far along in the episode without making it clear what we're talking about when we say egg freezing. And while I'd love to lay it all out for you, well, we have someone way better for that than me. Let me introduce you to Dr. Kathy Hong from RMA of New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Kathy Hong. I'm a physician at RMA of New Jersey. In a typical month with egg freezing, you have a group of eggs that is dormant, and one of them is activated by the hormones that are secreted from the brain. And this allows one follicle to grow, which is a container for an egg, and that one grows and you ovulate that, and the egg is released and can potentially get together with a sperm if you're trying to get pregnant. The concept with egg freezing is that there are a number of dormant eggs that month that are otherwise not being activated. And instead of just utilizing the one that month to save for the future, what we can do is have you take medications that are usually in the form of injectable medications, and these basically step into the place of where your brain would normally stimulate the growth of one follicle, and you can stimulate the growth of the entire group of otherwise dormant follicles. So that group of follicles would normally just die off at the end of that month if you're not using them. The concept with egg freezing is that you can actually save the eggs within them for the future. It makes it much more efficient than just saving the one egg per month. And at the end of that month, you've saved yourself a group of eggs, and your future self can have access to a younger version of you to help to conceive with.
The eggs that are retrieved can then be frozen using vitrification, and those eggs can be kept in storage for as long as you might need them. The eggs won't age while frozen. When needed, they can be thawed and then utilized. We're going to hear more from Dr. Hong in a bit, but let's get back to Shannon. So Shannon realized that her goals for the future had changed, and while she wasn't ready now to have a baby, she did know that she now wanted to pursue motherhood down the road. Deciding that egg freezing is maybe a good fit is a big first step, but there's also a second step that can be a real roadblock for many. Egg freezing is basically half of an IVF cycle, and that means that it can be very expensive. But that's when Shannon found out that this wasn't going to be an issue for her, as her employer included egg freezing in their fertility benefit from Progyny.
You know, I wasn't really looking for the fertility benefit when I joined my current employer, but I found out about it pretty quickly after I joined and was just really excited about it. And it made it very easy for me to, kind of say yes to pursue this path. It was huge. I don't think that I even, as doing pretty well for myself, which I consider myself to do pretty well for myself for my age, I don't know that I would have been able to do it without Progyny. Once I found out the out-of-pocket costs for me were going to max out at $4,000, I figured out a way to swing it, and that made it really easy. But my understanding is that this can cost, upwards of $20,000 to do without the benefit. And so that would have been out of reach for me right now. I may have been able to do it at some time in the future, but no time like the present, as I have learned with egg freezing. Really it is the younger, the better. And 34, kind of reaching that tipping point into 35, where it starts to be more difficult for women to conceive naturally. It was really kind of aligned the right time for me to be able to do it.
Now, I've spoken to a few people about their egg freezing experiences at this point, and for the most part, many felt that the actual process wasn't as intimidating as they expected. But the expectations and the intimidation before the process begins is very real. Fortunately for Shannon, she had a built-in support system that could really help her get ready.
Yeah, I did. I had 3 very close friends who had been through the process for different reasons, and I had their experience that they passed along to me to tell me how it was for them and to tell me their perspective on it. And that really kind of inched me from, if this doesn't happen the old-fashioned way, I'm not going to do it, to, oh, I better at least meet with someone and, understand what my options are and whether this is the right choice for me. So I had a really strong support network.
Okay, so Shannon had the coverage in hand, and she had support and information about what to expect from friends. And it was time to get started. Here's Dr. Hong with a little more about how the process works.
When you do egg freezing and you take injectable medications, it usually takes about 7 to 10 days for those injectable medications to cause a group of follicles to grow. And when those follicles are at their optimal size, which can be measured on transvaginal ultrasound, then what you do is you take a trigger shot, which mimics what your body would normally give you to ovulate, except that it's timed so that before you actually ovulate and release those eggs, an egg retrieval is performed.
Yeah, so this is about a 2-week process. But before they can begin comes the initial consultation.
Yeah, so my first step was to meet with Progyny and to do that, and then did some research on my own. The first appointment, the first consultation was really just my doctor wanted to understand, kind of who I was, what my medical history was, and, was curious about what my expectations were and what I wanted to know. And what I wanted to know when I walked in is, should I do this? I was still unsure as of my first consultation, if it was right for me. And I had a very great experience where it just became very clear for me in that first consultation that no, I absolutely wanted to do this. I wanted to give myself every ability to preserve my fertility and have kids in the future biologically. So after that, I stopped having to take birth control so that they could do fertility testing. And then I just kind of started making the plan after I got my test results back and met with my doctor, which ended up being about a month later. Started making a plan to move forward. And I kind of knew right away that it was going to make sense for me to move forward.
Once the test came back and they had the all clear, it was time for Shannon to start self-administering injectable medications at home. This is the part that usually has people nervous.
It was easier than I expected. I think, I actually really enjoyed giving myself the shots. I know that is what causes a lot of people anxiety, but for me, I felt like I was kind of in a science experiment with my body. And, so being able to do the medication myself and then be able to go in and see my follicles growing and, just kind of seeing how my body responded, I thought it was really, really cool. I was surprised that I didn't feel bad. Like I had an expectation that once I started doing it, I wasn't going to feel good.
I've heard from a few women now that the shots aren't as bad as they feared. But of course, your miles may vary. Everyone will have their own experience, and the injections aren't the only part of this process, so let's stay tuned. After 7 to 10 days of medications at home and coming into the office periodically for morning monitoring, it's time for the egg retrieval. Here's Dr. Hong to break down what happens at the day of the retrieval.
On the day of the egg retrieval, you should expect to go to the clinic about an hour and a half before the actual procedure, and you'll get dressed into a patient gown. You'll have a discussion with the physician who's on call that day, as well as the anesthesiologist. You'll do paperwork and really just a bunch of administrative things before you actually get ready for the procedure. The procedure takes about 5 to 10 minutes to do. It is done completely while you're asleep, and it's usually under a form of IV sedation, so it's medication that goes through an IV to help you to fall asleep. And then you're asleep for 5 to 10 minutes, and during that time period, the transvaginal ultrasound probe is placed within the vagina, goes directly through the wall of the vagina into the follicle, and draws out the fluid that's inside that follicle. Remember, the follicle is the container for the egg, and that fluid is sent to the embryology lab, where embryologists search through the fluid and identify what we call the cumulus oocyte complexes, or the areas that look like they can contain eggs, and isolate them away from the rest of the fluid. And then later on that day, strip off the outer layer of those cells so that they can see what egg is actually inside it. And the eggs that are at the mature stage are able to be frozen at that time, just a few hours after the egg retrieval procedure. The patient herself has already gone home that day. She goes home about an hour after the procedure. And since this is a procedure in which she did not have any kind of incisions, then her recovery time is actually usually very quick. Most people resume their normal activities 1 to 2 days later.
All right, let's find out how Shannon experienced the retrieval.
Yeah, I was excited going into it. I was nervous when I was there. It's a surgical center, so it's a very medical feel. I was just ready to get it over with, and I just did a lot of meditating, and I think that there's always that fear anytime that you go in for anything that's like where you have to have anesthesia, but it was so fast. I was done very quickly and had a very good result, and just, kind of felt a little bit tired afterwards the day of.
Shannon shared that she was happy with the results. We try not to share too many specific results all the time, as that can kind of cloud people's expectations to hear. Shannon's experience is extremely helpful for anyone listening, but her results aren't actually going to be relevant to other people who have their own bodies. But Shannon got a lot of eggs. So many eggs, in fact, that she experienced a lot of bloating and some significant discomfort.
I was just very bloated and uncomfortable to the point that I actually called my doctor the day after my retrieval and actually went back in my ovaries. I'll never forget. So I read that ovaries are about to be supposed to be about 5 milliliters. And mine were like 86 milliliters and 92. So they were really, really big. And I was terribly uncomfortable for a couple of days, but that was really the worst of it. They gave me medication to bring down my estrogen pretty quickly. And so I was able to really feel back to normal about a week later. I still did not exercise or anything until I had gotten my next period, but I felt back to normal about a week after I had retrieval.
One potential risk of egg freezing is OHSS, which is ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which sounds an awful lot like what Shannon just described. This can actually be a quite dangerous thing if left untreated, so it's very good that Shannon brought this to her doctor's attention. OHSS is dangerous and doctors work to avoid it, but it's very difficult to predict how an individual will react to the medication. And the good news was that her ovaries were so bloated because, well, she got so many eggs.
Yes, I was very happy. In fact, I was I was preparing myself to have to go through a second round because, kind of through the process, I had realized that I want to be able to have enough eggs for at least 2 pregnancies. It was, just an amazing combination of luck and my body responding well to the medication and having a really great doctor. But I actually have enough for about 3 pregnancies based on what my doctor's recommendation is. So I was excited that I wasn't going to have to go through the process again. Although had like a weird morning when I, stopped doing the stim. It was a little bit sad because I had really slowed my life down in order to, take care of my body and make sure that I was doing everything just so, because there is, it's very specific, the medication that they give you. So there was like an interesting like sadness when I had to stop the stim and that I wouldn't be doing it anymore because I felt just so in touch with my body during that time and just, really in harmony with kind of what I knew was my desired outcome.
Shannon achieved her goal for the egg freezing process with her first cycle. As I mentioned, everyone is going to get a different number of eggs, and it will depend on a variety of factors. So if you're wondering how many eggs you should expect at an egg retrieval, well, that's absolutely something to discuss with your doctor. And to back that up, here's Dr. Hong.
The goal for egg freezing is to save as many as possible from that month during which you're doing the egg retrieval. The analogy that I often make is that everybody's egg supply has a different capacity to grow. And we want to grow whatever your biological max is that month. But that may differ from you to your neighbor. Everybody's gonna have a different capacity for growth. I'm 5'4". If I ate more food, I'm not going to be taller than 5'4". And this is the kind of thing where you say, well, if you get more medication, will you make more eggs? You won't, because the natural capacity of the egg supply is that only what is available is what can grow. So the goal for every person is to get to their biological max, or 100% of what they can achieve in that month, not necessarily what someone else has achieved, because we want to make sure that that month has yielded as much out of it as you can. And so we want to reach every person's biological max, which can be anywhere from 1 egg to 70 eggs. Again, in this, I'm talking about extremes. Most people are going to be somewhere in the maybe 6 to 12 number. But again, this is like asking about an average height. How tall can someone be or how short can someone be? You really just want to achieve your biological maximum.
Yes, and that's why we stopped asking people to share their exact outcomes every time. We keep that information in some episodes when relevant for context of that story, but we really want to emphasize that you should not set your expectations based on what someone else experienced when it comes to numbers like these. So Shannon is more than happy with the amount of eggs that she now has in storage. We asked if having these eggs has allowed her to change her perspective about everything in the future.
Totally. Yeah, it really has. The date that I have kind of put to when I will revisit whether I need to, go it alone, if you will, is 38. And so I turned 35 in September in just a couple months here. So I really, what I'm focused on right now is just kind of planning for the future in case I decide that I want to, pursue IVF on my own. And it still feels intuitive to me to try to find a partner to do this with. Like, that's what I'm really looking for is a partner. And, hopefully we'll be able to conceive naturally, but having this investment and having done this for myself and, having had a successful outcome where I feel like I just have a lot of options for the future.
It was an episode titled Evolution in season 2 of Sex and the City, where Miranda, who was 33 at the time, spoke about freezing her eggs. The episode aired back in 1999. It must have been almost jarring for audiences of that time to hear about. Today, we can all agree that Miranda was just ahead of her time.
I think it has become a lot more normal for, women to be able to choose to do this as they get older. But, that biological element that we just can't get away from, right? Like, I don't know exactly what my timeline is, but at some point my body will biologically not be able to have children anymore. So whether that's fair or not, I would argue it's not fair, and it's less fair to women that we have to, think about these things a little bit more intentionally. But what I do feel like I have is my attitude about it and the actions that I take. So I didn't want to let indecision, which is a choice, not deciding is a choice in and of itself. I didn't want just lapsing in fear around making the choice to make the choice for me.
We haven't really talked much about the coverage that Shannon had access to for this life-changing treatment. Shannon, like most of us, gets her healthcare coverage through her employer. And her employer is the one who chose to add the Progyny benefit and to include egg freezing in that coverage. And Shannon is not taking that for granted.
Yeah, it's funny. The reason that I ended up here is because I wrote a letter to my employer and to my benefits team to say thank you. I wanted them to know how deeply meaningful it was to me as an individual and as an employee. It's been so life-changing and life-affirming for me to be able to have access to this. I really have looked for opportunities to be able to share this experience because it really does feel joyful, empowering to be able to kind of take this little tiny piece of control that I can, and knowing that I don't have control over so many things, and so many things can happen in life still, but it was really important to me that VF had this.
Yes, employers who choose to offer this benefit to their employees are making a powerful statement about the importance of supporting all of their employees. If you're considering freezing your eggs, your first step should be to check with your employer. See if they have coverage for fertility preservation. If you don't have coverage for this now, it's important to remember that most employers add Progyny coverage because an employee asked for it. So now would be a good time for you to start that conversation. And as I mentioned at the opening, we do have resources for you to help at progyny.com/talk-to-HR. And look, we know that egg freezing can feel intimidating. It can be a scary idea to pursue. But for Shannon, now having gone through it, it's something way more powerful than frightening.
This was one of the most powerful, empowering and joyful experiences that I've ever been through. Just kind of from like the beginning of pushing through the fear of, what does this mean? Going through some of the emotions associated with this, some of the grief and shame, and being able to work through that, and come out the other side and have options for future Shannon feels really, really good. And so I'm really glad that I did it.
I want to thank Shannon for sharing her story with us today. And I want to thank her employer, VF Corporation, for supporting their employees with this powerful benefit. I also want to thank Dr. Kathy Hong from RMA of New Jersey for bringing her expertise to this conversation. And of course, I want to thank you for joining us. If you want to connect with us, you can do so on Instagram at This Is Infertility Podcast. If you want to follow Progyny, you can do that at Progyny Inc. Of course, if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating and review. And if you're watching here on YouTube, you got to smash the like button. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny. Please remember, this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Dan Bolger, and this is Infertility.